"Slaves don't read," Mr. Roberts said. "I should beat you for lying, girl." And that is just a small excerpt, but was one that caught my attention right away. As you can see on the timeline, I actually started before that date to take you back to the beginning of the Revolutionary War and one of the first battles that took place as the early patriots were claiming their independence, even before the Declaration of Independence was written. It began on March 17, 1776, with the Siege of Boston, and this was a battle that actually gave the patriots the bravery to think that they could win a war against the strong British army. It was a victory led by General George Washington, and it gave them the confidence to go on and continue. From Boston, General Washington took him and his troops to New York, which is an island, and they chose to go to the Manhattan Island because they said that they knew the British were coming and that it was an important water port and that this is where the British would land and that they needed to protect this particular location. That was in April. We don't get to know Isabel's story until about May, and you can see May 27th is the excerpt I just read from you, and what it goes on to explain is that Isabel and her little sister Ruth, who was handicapped to some degree mentally because of a smallpox disease they had when they were younger, eventually are sold to a couple by the name of the Locktons. They're originally in Newport, New Jersey, but after they were sold to the Locktons, they had a home in New York, and so they took a 2-day trip and eventually landed on the island. So as they land, they come off the boat and right away can tell the Locktons aren't well liked in this area. The Patriots, of course, have now moved in with Washington and his troops, and the Locktons happen to be loyalists to King George and to Britain, and they believe that the United States should remain part of Britain. So when they arrive back, they're not met very kindly. In fact, some of the officers try to search their ship for something that would prove that they are loyalists to be able to throw them in jail or put them on trial. One of the people that approaches the Locktons also has a slave by the name of Curzon, and Curzon becomes a good friend to Isabel. They're both children at this point, but they are also slaves and do a lot of work as children. Then we catch up with Isabel again in June 7th, 1776. She discovers from Curzon, who tells her about how slaves of people that are loyalists are often spies. And this is actually something that took place in history, that slaves of both patriots and of loyalists became spies in hopes of the other side freeing them from their owners, and that's exactly what Isabel hopes to do. The Locktons turn out to be very mean, especially the wife, and Isabel is constantly worried about her safety and being able to stay together with her sister Ruth. So her hope is that by spying on the Locktons, they'll be able to go and eventually earn their freedom. We again meet up in June 23rd, 1776 with Isabel, and this is kind of a turning point. Isabel decides to turn over the Locktons conspiracy. Lockton and some of his cohorts are plotting to kill General George Washington, and she delivers this message to Colonel Reagan, and they're able to foil the plot before George Washington is assassinated. There were actually many plots to kill George Washington at the time by loyalists that were in the area because both patriots and loyalists still lived on Manhattan Island at the time. On June 29th, we not only see in the book, but in real life, June 29th, 1776 is the first time they see British ships arriving from Britain in order to squash the rebellion at that time. And they're spotted landing on Staten Island, not too far away from Manhattan Island. Just after that, on July 2nd, just a few days after showing up in the harbor, the British easily take control of Staten Island, and they land up to 32,000 soldiers. And they take over this island, which the island is not big enough to hold that many people, so they know it's just a matter of time before the British march or continue inward to Manhattan Island and then on to the mainland. At this time period, this is the time that Congress decides that it's time to officially declare their independence. And of course, the date we all know, July 4th, 1776, is when the United States declares its independence from Britain. If we skip down to July 9th, 1776, this was an interesting point that I was unaware of in history. It was actually just a few days after the Declaration was written, and they are going around to different places. And in New York, July 9th is the date that the Declaration is read to a crowd of several patriots. And the British have yet to land on Manhattan Island at this point. In the midst of reading it, a mob forms and they go and tear down this infamous statue of King George III. And the statue is ripped apart and paraded through the streets. The pieces are, and eventually most of the statue is melted down into musket balls, which are eventually fired at their own, at British soldiers. In the story, Isabel actually is there on July 9th, and she's able to collect a piece of that statue and keep it with her in her pocket. July 9th is also a big day for Isabel because on this day, Madame Lockton, as she called her, decides to sell Ruth unbeknownst to Isabel. In fact, in the middle of the night is when she takes Ruth and Isabel is sleeping and sells her. And when she wakes up, of course, Isabel goes crazy, and that's the first time Isabel tries to run. She runs to Colonel Reagan, who she gave the message to about the conspiracy to murder General George Washington, in hopes that for all her work and her spying that she's done for the last couple months, that he'll keep her and she can work for the Patriots and earn her freedom back. Unfortunately, this isn't the case. He says that they have to still follow the laws and that he turns her back over to Mrs. Lockton, who promptly has her beaten and put into the stocks. She ends up in the stocks for a few days. July 15th is when she actually is removed from the stocks, and as soon as she's removed from the stocks, Madame Lockton has a brand branded to her cheek. It's really hard for me to read this part of the book, but it also shows her character and her bravery and her strength through the whole ordeal. I stands for insolence, and Madame Lockton chose that because she felt like she was an insolent slave from the beginning and that she was never done exactly as she's told. The story continues and we learn more about Isabel's plight and the ordeal that she goes through while helping Madame Lockton. And during this time, the British are planning and plotting to go from Staten Island to Manhattan Island, and that is when we catch up with Isabel again. Isabel and Curzon have had their falling out at this point because after Isabel was branded, she vows never to spy for the Patriots again. In fact, she says she'll do anything to help the Loyalists because the Patriots turned their backs on her. But her friend Curzon remains loyal, and in fact, he goes off to fight because they know the British are getting ready to sail to Manhattan Island, and he joins the army in hopes that his fighting will earn his freedom and he'll be a free slave after the war is done. And of course, both sides thought the war would be short and over with soon, and that is not how reality turned out. Just a day later in real life, on August 27, 1776, is when the Battle of what they call Brooklyn, sometimes it's known as the Battle of Long Island as well, begins. The British invade Manhattan Island and they began to fight the Patriot soldiers. This battle does not go like the Battle of Boston or the Siege of Boston, and the Patriots are easily defeated by the Loyalist troops that have created this plan, and they have to flee the island and go to the mainland. But before everything is said and done, over 1,000 soldiers are captured and taken to prison camps. The prison camps are anywhere from ships or hulls of boats that the British brought over to post office, churches, different commons buildings that were on the island already that they end up turning into makeshift prisons. Isabel remains on the island through it all, and life for the Lockton gets a lot easier because now that the British are in charge, they come back to power and they get to enjoy the finer things in life. And Isabel has to cater to their every want and desire. In fact, she eventually finds Curzon, and she sees that Curzon happens to be one of the captured soldiers. So she decides to start taking him meals and bread because the conditions of the prisons in that time, over half of the soldiers in those prisons end up dying of disease and starvation and different types of things, the winters and that type of thing. Before the winter arrives, though, there's this other point in history that's mentioned in the book that I was unaware that had happened, but it happened on September 15th, 1776. They think it was a patriot that started the fire, but over 1/3 of what we know now as New York City is burned to the ground. They believe that it was a patriot that did this because at that point the British had taken over the city and they didn't want the British to be able to use the houses and all the things that they had built up to be able to stay strong as an army. And so this fire